I had just finished reviewing my monthly finances when my phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from my uncle, the kind that carried an unsettling weight before I even opened it. "I thought you should see this." Attached was a video. No context, just a timestamp from a few days ago. Curious but wary, I tapped play. The screen filled with the dim glow of my parents' living room. They sat on the couch, my mother clutching a cup of tea, my father rubbing his temples like he had a headache. The image alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. Something about their postures, the way they slumped into the furniture, hinted at a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Then my mother spoke. "I don't know how much longer we can pretend. He's just a burden," my father muttered. I felt my breath hitch. My grip on the phone tightened. "We never asked him to take on the loan," my mother continued, shaking her head. "It's not like we forced him, but honestly, it's a relief. At least we don't have to worry about it." My heart pounded as the words sank in. For the past year, I had been covering my parents' loan payments. They had never asked, but I saw them struggling, saw the foreclosure notices, the anxiety in their voices when they spoke about bills. So I stepped in, quietly, dutifully, because that's what family does. And now, I was staring at the truth I had never suspected. To them, I wasn't their son stepping up in their time of need. I was just a burden. I replayed the video. Once, twice. Each time, their words cut deeper. "We never asked him to take on the loan. He's just a burden." It was surreal hearing my parents talk about me like that. Like I was some kind of inconvenience rather than the person keeping their heads above water. I sat frozen, the phone still in my hands, my mind trying to make sense of it. Maybe I misheard? Maybe they didn't mean it the way it sounded? But no matter how many times I played it back, the message was clear. They didn't appreciate what I was doing. They resented it. A sharp knock at the door jolted me back to reality. I shoved my phone into my pocket and stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. When I opened the door, my uncle stood there, his expression unreadable. "Did you watch it?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "Yeah." He nodded slowly. "I debated whether to send it to you, but you deserve to know." I didn't answer. I just stepped aside, letting him in. He walked past me into the small apartment I had been struggling to afford ever since I took on my parents' debt. Every corner was proof of the sacrifices I had made. Late rent notices stacked on the kitchen counter. A fridge half empty because grocery money always seemed to disappear too fast. I had put their needs before my own. And for what? Uncle Paul turned to face me. "I'm sorry you had to hear it that way." I ran a hand through my hair, still reeling. "Have they always felt this way?" He hesitated. That pause told me everything. "How long have you known?" I pressed. Paul sighed and lowered himself onto my couch. "They don't talk like that all the time. But, yeah, they've said things before." My jaw clenched. "And you never thought to tell me?" "I thought it was just frustration talking," he admitted. "They're drowning in their own mess. I figured they'd come around and realize what you're doing for them. But when I heard this, I couldn't let it slide anymore." I sat down across from him, my hands clasped together, trying to push past the hurt. "So what now? What am I supposed to do with this?" Paul studied me for a long moment. "That's up to you. But how could I decide when I wasn't even sure who I was anymore?" The silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. My uncle had done his part. He had given me the truth, but now the weight of it was mine to carry. I leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. My mind kept cycling through the past year. Every sacrifice, every late-night calculation to make sure I could cover the next loan payment without falling too far behind on my own bills. Every time I reassured my parents that I wanted to help, that it wasn't a burden. What a joke. "You okay?" Paul asked, breaking the quiet. "Yeah." My voice was hoarse. I didn't believe the lie, and neither did he. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Listen, I know this hurts, but before you do anything, think it through." I turned my head toward him, frowning. "Think what through?" He hesitated, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What you want to do with this information. I know you, kid. You've got a good heart, and that's exactly why they've been able to lean on you so much. But now you've seen how they really feel. I hated how right he was. Paul continued, his tone careful. So you need to ask yourself, are you going to keep shouldering their debt, knowing they don't appreciate it? Or are you going to walk away? The words walk away made my stomach twist. I wasn't sure I could do it. They were my parents. I didn't do this for gratitude. I did it because I thought it was the right thing. Because I loved them. But now I wasn't sure what any of it meant. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. I don't know. Paul nodded like he expected that answer. Then take some time to figure it out. He stood, grabbing his jacket. Just remember, no one gets to take advantage of you unless you let them. His words followed me long after he left. And that night, for the first time in months, I didn't send the payment for their loan. The next morning, my alarm blared at 6:30 a.m. like it always did. But this time, I didn't get up right away. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the payment I hadn't sent. It was just 1 month. One missed installment. It wasn't like the world would collapse overnight. But the knowledge sat heavy on my chest. Would they call me? Would they panic? Or would they assume I'd forgotten and brush it off, never realizing I had made a choice? I forced myself up and went about my routine, but everything felt different. The coffee tasted bitter. The morning light coming through my window felt too harsh. Even the silence in my apartment felt loud. By noon, my phone was still quiet. No messages. No missed calls. I told myself I was relieved, but deep down, I knew better. They hadn't noticed. Or worse, they had noticed and still didn't care. Around 2 p.m., I got a text from my mother. For a brief second, hope flickered in my chest. Mom. Hey, can you pick up some groceries for us this weekend? Nothing too expensive, just the basics. Nothing about the loan. Nothing about the money I had been sending. Just another request like always. I stared at the message for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. A dozen responses ran through my head. I can't this time. I'm busy. Figure it out yourselves. But instead I just typed, me, I'll see. Not a yes. Not a no. Just enough to buy me some time. I tossed my phone onto the couch and exhaled. It was a small thing. Skipping one loan payment, hesitating on one request, but it felt like I had cracked open a door I never knew was there. A door that led somewhere I had never let myself consider. What if I didn't have to keep carrying them? The longer I went without sending the payment, the more the weight shifted. At first, it felt unbearable, like I was waiting for an explosion that never came. But as the hours turned to days, I realized something strange. Nothing happened. No angry calls. No panicked messages. No one asking why the money hadn't gone through. And that's when it hit me. They weren't even checking. I had spent months scraping by, cutting corners, skipping meals, all so I could cover their debt. I had assumed they needed me, that they depended on me. But if they weren't even tracking the payments, how much did they really care? Did they just assume I'd always take care of it? Or worse, did they think I owed them? That thought burned through me like a slow fire. By the weekend, I still hadn't replied to my mom's grocery request. I knew she would send another message soon, maybe something guilt-ridden about how they were running low on food. But I was starting to see the pattern. They didn't ask me how I was doing. Didn't wonder if I was struggling. I was only valuable to them as long as I was useful. The realization made my stomach twist, but I needed to test it further. So I made a decision. I didn't visit that weekend. For the first time in a year, I spent my Saturday without stepping foot in my parents' house. Instead, I went out, walked around downtown, bought myself lunch at a small cafe, something I hadn't done in months because every extra penny had gone to their loan. And for a moment I felt free. That feeling didn't last. Sunday evening, my phone rang. Mom. I hesitated before answering. Hey, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Where were you yesterday? She asked immediately. No greeting. No how are you? I forced a casual tone. Had some things to do. A beat of silence. Then a sigh. Well, you could have told us. I swallowed. You could have asked. Another silence, this one heavier. Then she changed the subject. Anyway, we're out of a few things. Could you pick up some groceries and drop them off tomorrow? There it was. Like clockwork. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone a little tighter. I can't, I said simply. Mom's breath hitched. What do you mean you can't? I hesitated, then exhaled slowly. I mean, I can't keep doing this. I've been paying your loan for a year. I've been covering groceries, gas, everything. And my voice caught, but I pushed through. I can't anymore. A long silence. Then, laughter. Soft at first, then growing. A bitter, amused sound that made my stomach sink. Oh, honey, Mom said, her tone almost pitying. You're being dramatic. We never asked you to do any of that. I felt something inside me snap. Right? I said, my voice suddenly cold. You never asked. But you never said no either. Mom sighed. Listen, if this is about the money. It's always been about the money. I cut in. And that's the problem. She didn't respond right away. And in that pause, I knew I had hit something real. You're overreacting, she said finally, her voice clipped. We're family. Families help each other. Funny? I murmured. Because I don't feel helped. That silence stretched longer this time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was colder. Well, if you're going to be selfish about it, then I guess we'll manage on our own. There it was. The shift. The moment I was no longer useful, I became the villain. I closed my eyes, nodding to myself. Okay, I said, keeping my voice steady. Then you'll manage. And I hung up. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down. The guilt tried to creep in, whispering that I had done something wrong, that I had turned my back on my family. But beneath that, there was something else. Relief. I wasn't free yet. But for the first time, I had taken a step toward something I never thought I could have. A life that was mine. The silence after that call was heavier than I expected. I sat there, phone still in my hands, waiting for something. Another message, another call, some final plea that would make me question everything. But nothing came. I had walked away from my parents' expectations, from the responsibility I had carried for so long, and instead of an explosion, there was just quiet. At least for a little while. I was at work when the first message came in. Mom, we need to talk. I ignored it. A few hours later, another. Mom, I don't understand why you're acting like this. We're your parents. By the afternoon. Mom, you're really going to abandon us over a few words? And then, as if she had been waiting for me to finally respond, she pulled the last trick she had left. Mom, fine. If you don't care about us, we'll figure it out on our own. But don't expect us to be there for you when you need us. I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. That was it. The last card. Guilt. For a long time that would have worked. But now, I locked my phone and put it away. I had already made my decision. The phone calls started. Mom tried first. I didn't answer. Then Dad. I let it ring. Then, finally, the number I wasn't expecting. My aunt. Not my uncle, the one who had sent me the video. My mom's sister, Lisa. That one gave me pause. I hesitated, then answered. Hello. A long sigh on the other end. So, Aunt Lisa said, I hear you've started a family war. I let out a breath of laughter, shaking my head. Of course she called you. Of course she did, Lisa said. So, want to tell me what's going on? Or should I just go off what she's saying? Depends, I said. What's she saying? Lisa made a thoughtful hum. That you're suddenly refusing to help, that you've decided you don't care about family, and that you've been listening to bad influences who are trying to turn you against them. I scoffed. Right? And did she happen to mention the video Uncle Paul sent me? Silence. Then a sharp inhale. What video? I felt something cold settle in my chest. So they hadn't told her. Slowly I exhaled. Lisa, I said carefully. Before I say anything else, I need you to do something for me. That depends. Watch the video. I'll send it to you, and then we can talk. She hesitated. Then, finally, okay. I sent the video. A minute later I got a text. Lisa called back. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, different. I had no idea, she admitted. I mean, I knew they leaned on you a lot, but I didn't think. She cut herself off. I didn't think they were like that. Yeah, I muttered. Neither did I. A long silence. Then, she sighed. Look, I can't change them, and I'm not going to tell you what to do. But whatever choice you make, it has to be yours. Not theirs. Not Paul's. Yours. I swallowed hard, nodding to myself. I know. And if you decide to cut them off? Another pause. Then, Lisa's voice softened. You won't be alone. For the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. Days passed, but the storm didn't. My parents stopped calling, but that didn't mean they had given up. Instead, they sent waves of guilt through other people. Family, friends, distant relatives, even my old neighbor. Each conversation was the same. They're your parents. They did so much for you. How can you turn your back on them over one little thing? One little thing. Like it wasn't a year of sacrifices. Like it wasn't my entire life rearranged around making sure they were okay. Like it wasn't the gut-wrenching realization that they had never seen me as anything more than a resource to be tapped into. I was tired of explaining myself. Aunt Lisa was the only one who didn't try to change my mind. She listened. She understood. And when the guilt started creeping in again, because no matter how justified I was, it still tried to dig its claws into me, she reminded me that I had done more than enough. You know what's funny? I said to her one evening over the phone. They never even asked how I was doing. Lisa exhaled sharply, like she had been holding back her own frustration. Because they don't want to know, she said. Because that would mean facing the truth. The truth. That they had used me. That I had let them. That I was finally walking away. A week after my last conversation with them, I checked the loan balance out of morbid curiosity. If they had really managed on their own like my mother had claimed, then they would have found a way to pay it, right? But the balance was unchanged. Not a single payment had been made. They hadn't even tried. And that's when I knew, without a doubt, that I had made the right choice. I wasn't their son. I was their safety net. And I had finally let go. Letting go wasn't as simple as making a decision. It was a process, one that unfolded in small, unexpected ways. At first, I thought I would feel some immediate sense of relief, but instead, there was an emptiness. I had spent so much time structuring my life around my parents' needs that, without that burden, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. Some days, I convinced myself I had done the right thing. Other days, doubt crept in, whispering that I had overreacted, that I should have tried harder to make things work. The hardest part wasn't the silence from them. It was the silence in my own head when I started questioning if I had made a mistake. I found myself staring at my phone more times than I wanted to admit, expecting a message, an apology, something that would prove I had mattered beyond what I could provide. But nothing came. Lisa was the only one who understood. She never told me what to do, never tried to push me one way or the other. Instead, she reminded me that I had done enough, that it wasn't wrong to hope my parents would change, but I had to ask myself if I was waiting for something that had never existed in the first place. That thought unsettled me. I had always believed that love, real love, meant sacrifice. That taking care of family was just what you did, no questions asked. But now, I had to wonder if I had mistaken obligation for love, if I had been clinging to an idea of family that was only true on my side. A few weeks after I cut them off, a message came from an unknown number. I knew immediately that it was my mother. There was no warmth in her words, only resentment. She saw my decision as abandonment, as a betrayal. But what struck me the most was how quickly she shifted the blame. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't acknowledge the years I had spent helping them. Instead, she implied that I had been influenced, that someone else had convinced me to walk away. It was then that I realized she was talking about Paul. Growing up, I had always seen my uncle as the selfish one, the relative who had distanced himself from the family for reasons no one ever fully explained. My mother never spoke of him kindly, and I had absorbed her version of events without question. Now I saw it differently. Maybe Paul hadn't abandoned the family. Maybe he had simply walked away from the same cycle I had just broken. For a long time, I stared at the message, feeling a strange mix of anger and clarity. My mother wasn't trying to mend things. She wasn't trying to reach out because she missed me. She missed what I had provided. The realization was painful, but it was also freeing. The next morning, Lisa called and told me that my parents had finally reached out to her. They hadn't wanted to talk about what had happened, hadn't even mentioned the things they had said in the video. Instead, they had tried to get her to intervene to convince me to come back. When she refused, the conversation quickly turned cold. That was when I knew. If they had truly wanted to fix things, they would have led with an apology. They would have acknowledged what they had done. But instead, they had treated my absence the same way they had treated my presence, as something to be managed, controlled, and used for their own benefit. This wasn't just a falling out. It wasn't a temporary conflict that would smooth over with time. This was the truth of who they were. And now I had to decide what kind of life I wanted to live, knowing that truth. The truth settled in slowly, like an ache that I had been ignoring for too long. My parents weren't going to change. They weren't going to reach out with an apology, weren't going to acknowledge what I had done for them. They had never seen me as a person separate from my usefulness to them, and without that, I simply didn't exist in the way they wanted. That thought should have hurt more than it did. But instead, it brought a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, my mind wasn't consumed with numbers, payments, or how I would balance my own bills while keeping up with theirs. There was no more waiting for their next request, no more structuring my life around their needs. The absence of it all was startling at first, but in that empty space, I started to see possibilities. I had spent so long trying to keep my parents afloat that I had never stopped to think about what I wanted for myself. Without them pulling me in every direction, I was left standing in an unfamiliar place, with time, with money, with freedom that felt foreign. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I went to work, came home, and found myself pacing my apartment, unsure how to fill the silence. I walked through grocery stores without rushing, without calculating what I could spare for them. I sat in cafes, ordering something for myself without guilt. It was all so small, so simple, and yet, each act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Lisa checked in often, and though I appreciated her support, I knew she was giving me space to figure things out. She never told me what I should do next, never pushed me toward forgiveness or encouraged me to sever things completely. She just listened, and that was enough. Weeks passed, and the calls and messages from my parents slowed. Maybe they had finally accepted that I wasn't coming back. Maybe they were just waiting for another opportunity to pull me in again. I wasn't sure, but I no longer found myself checking my phone with the same anxious expectation. One evening, I sat on my balcony, looking out over the city, and a thought came to me. One that I had never allowed myself to consider before. What if this wasn't just a temporary break? What if I never went back? For so long, I had convinced myself that walking away from family was something you simply did not do. That no matter what, you stayed, you helped, you sacrificed. But what if that wasn't true? What if love wasn't about obligation? What if I could finally live for myself? The idea terrified me, but it also felt like the closest thing to freedom I had ever known. I had spent my whole life believing that family was something unshakable, that no matter what happened, you stood by the people who raised you. But now, as I looked at my life without them in it, I realized that belief had never been tested, at least not until now. Days turned into weeks, and my parents remained distant. There were no more messages, no more calls. It wasn't that they had finally understood my decision. It was that they had chosen to move on without me, the same way they always had when something was no longer useful to them. I was no longer a source of support, so they no longer had a reason to keep me close. That should have broken me. But instead, it solidified everything I had come to understand. They hadn't lost me. They had never truly seen me to begin with. There was no dramatic ending. No moment of closure where they admitted their mistakes and tried to repair what was broken. And maybe that was the real tragedy, that some things don't end with resolution, just quiet acceptance. For a long time, I had defined myself by what I could do for others, by how much I could give, by how much I could endure. But now, for the first time, I had to define myself in a different way. I started making plans for myself. I looked at opportunities one had ignored for years, things I had told myself I couldn't afford to dream about because my obligations had always come first. I finally moved into a better apartment, one that didn't feel like it was closing in on me. I stopped calculating my budget down to the last cent, stopped skipping meals to stretch my money just a little further. I traveled, just once, to a place I had always wanted to see, and for the first time, I felt what it was like to exist without guilt. Lisa remained in my life, the only family member who had truly stood by me, and I was grateful for that. I never asked if she still spoke to my parents. It didn't matter. That part of my life was closed. One day, months later, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. I knew who it was from before I even opened it. The letter was short, distant. My mother's words were careful, measured. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask me to come back. Instead, she wrote about how she and my father were managing, and that they hoped I was doing well. There was no warmth in it, no real attempt to mend things. Just a quiet acknowledgement that I still existed, somewhere outside their world. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unsure what to do with it. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had already made my choice. And for the first time in my life, it was truly mine. The end.